Affleck and Vin Diesel star in The Boiler Room, starting now over on Film 4. Here on Channel 4, Stalin takes center stage as we chart Roosevelt's most disastrous decision.
April the 12th, 1945, dawned brightly at the country retreat of the American president, Franklin Roosevelt. His companion, Daisy Suckley, was with him.
Another beautiful day. F woke up with a slight headache and a stiff neck, which probably comes from being overtired.
Despite his exhaustion, Roosevelt was having to face up to an agonizing dilemma. He had reached the pivotal moment in a psychological duel he'd been waging with his wartime ally, the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. Roosevelt had steadfastly followed one consistent course, which he believed was the way to win Stalin's collaboration in creating a better world. He'd once put it like this:
I think if I give Stalin everything I possibly can and ask nothing from him in return, noblesse oblige, he won't try to annex anything and will work with me for a world of peace and democracy.
Now, as the war entered its final stage, Roosevelt's great gamble with Stalin hung in the balance. Would the Soviet leader repay his generosity, or was he the oppressor, building a new totalitarian empire? At stake was the freedom and independence of the nations of Europe and the future of hundreds of millions of people. On July the 20th, 1944, fate decreed that the war would be fought to the bitter end. Hitler survived an assassination attempt at his eastern headquarters, the Wolf's Lair. He would never surrender. Inevitably, Europe would end up under the control of the Americans and British advancing from the west, and the Russians from the east. But what sort of Europe? On the evening of the assassination attempt, Hitler remarked,
"This war must be won or Europe will be lost to Bolshevism. I am the only one who sees the danger and the only one who can stop it."
Hitler believed Bolshevism could only be stopped by war. Franklin Roosevelt thought the opposite. From the moment Russia was forced into war in 1941, Roosevelt had instinctively understood that he and Stalin would emerge as the two leaders of the two powers upon whom long-term peace would depend. But culturally and politically, they were a world apart. Roosevelt was an American patrician, brought up in luxury and educated at Harvard. Stalin, a cobbler's son, beaten by his father, his university the cells of revolution. In the 1930s, Roosevelt was the optimistic face of America's New Deal. Stalin, the paranoid orchestrator of Russia's terror. Despite these differences, Roosevelt believed it was possible to persuade Stalin, by using the carrot, not the stick, to adopt a more democratic view of the world. He also believed that he, an American progressive, rather than anyone tainted by old-fashioned European imperialism, was the man to do it. As early as spring 1942, he'd written to Churchill,
Stalin hates the guts of all your top people. He thinks he likes me better, and I hope he will continue to do so.
For over 2 years, Roosevelt conducted his relationship with Stalin via messages and intermediaries. Then, in November 1943, at the Tehran Conference, he finally met him face to face. His tactic was to find a common bond with Stalin by teasing Churchill. Later, he described to a colleague how, on the third morning, he finally got through.
I said, lifting my hand to cover a whisper, which of course had to be interpreted, "Winston is cranky this morning. He got up on the wrong side of the bed." A vague smile passed over Stalin's eyes, and I decided I was on the right track. I began to tease Churchill about his Britishness, about John Bull, about his cigars, about his habits. Winston got red and scowled, and the more he did so, the more Stalin smiled. Finally, Stalin broke into a deep, hearty guffaw, and for the first time in 3 days, I saw the light. The ice was broken, and we talked like men and brothers.
Stalin behaved respectfully toward Roosevelt, in marked contrast to the rudeness he sometimes displayed to Churchill. And Roosevelt concluded from their conversations that Stalin was fundamentally a practical man he could do business with. He was hopeful that trust would build. In July 1944, he was relaxing at his country house, Hyde Park, with his close companion and confidant, Daisy Suckley, who kept a detailed diary of her conversations with the president.
July 3rd, 1944. I told the P that his relations with Stalin are one of the great triumphs of his career, and only the future can tell how much that relationship is going to count in rebuilding our shattered world. Before they met, there was doubt and suspicion on Stalin's part, and also probably on the P's. Now there is the basis for talking, for working things out together. The P smiled at me and said he keeps his fingers crossed.
The first concrete test of how far Roosevelt was succeeding with Stalin would be Poland. By the summer of 1944, Russian forces were smashing through Poland in their drive towards Germany. But beneath military success lay political division. Stalin had broken off relations with the London-based Polish government in exile after it had accused Russia of murdering thousands of Polish officers at Katyn Forest in 1940. Instead, he was backing a group of communist Poles based in Moscow as a future Polish government. But in a letter to Roosevelt and Churchill at the end of July, Stalin showed a more conciliatory face.
I understand the importance of the Polish question for the common cause of the Allies, and for this very reason I am prepared to give assistance to all Poles and to mediate in the attainment of an agreement between them.
For Roosevelt, the message seemed a vindication that his tactics with Stalin were working. That month, he gave an unequivocal assurance to the Prime Minister of the London Poles, Stanislaw Mikołajczyk.
Don't worry. Stalin doesn't intend to take freedom from you. I shall see to it that your country does not come out of this war injured.
Events in Poland were about to test both Stalin's sincerity and Roosevelt's strength of purpose. On August 1st, 1944, the Polish National Underground Army in Warsaw, knowing the Russians were close by, rose up against the Nazis. A terrible tragedy, which would cast a dark shadow on the behavior of the two warlords, was about to unfold. By the end of July 1944, Allied forces from both East and West had their sights on Germany. After the D-Day landings, the British and Americans were about to break out of Normandy. The Red Army had reached the River Vistula, just 15 miles from the Polish capital, Warsaw. Then, on August the 1st, the Polish underground in Warsaw started an uprising against the Nazis. It was depending on the Russian forces just a few miles away to help. Its future was in Stalin's hands. But at this very moment, the State Department in Washington forwarded to Roosevelt a desperate message it had received from the commander of the Polish underground. It concerned the activities of the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, in areas of Poland already liberated by Russian troops.
The Soviet authorities are arresting the officers in command and the staffs of the Polish underground army. The same fate undoubtedly awaits the leaders of the Polish underground civilian administration. Please do your best to save these people from liquidation by the NKVD.
On August the 8th, a week into the rising, the Russian commander on the Vistula was ready to cross the river and head for Warsaw. Inside the city, the Nazis were bringing in massive firepower to suppress the rising. The underground appealed for help. On its behalf, Churchill cabled Stalin.
12th of August. I have seen a distressing message from the Poles in Warsaw, who after 10 days are still fighting against considerable German forces which have cut the city into 3. They implore machine guns and ammunition. Can you not give them some further help?
Because of Soviet secrecy, there is no documentation of Stalin's motives during the next few days. They can only be deduced from his actions. He could see that the fiercely independent Polish underground, which would resist any future Soviet puppet government, was both distracting Nazi forces and at the same time being killed off by them. He also knew that Warsaw was a tough military target. He decided to halt the army on the Vistula and not to help the Warsaw Poles. Instead, he turned his attention to a softer target in Eastern Europe, Romania. And he claimed to Churchill that the Polish underground had acted irresponsibly in starting the uprising and did not deserve support.
August 16th, 1944. After probing more deeply into the Warsaw affair, I have come to the conclusion that the Warsaw action is a reckless and fearful gamble, taking a heavy toll of the population.
Churchill forwarded Stalin's message to Roosevelt. At the same time, Roosevelt's ambassador in Moscow, Avril Harriman, who'd so far tended to trust Stalin, now began to suspect his motives. He cabled the president.
The Soviet government's refusal to help Warsaw is not based on operational difficulties, nor on a denial of the conflict, but on ruthless political calculations.
Stalin's decision meant that the only way to help the Poles was by British and American airdrops. But their planes were based far away in Britain and Italy. Their chances of consistent success depended on being able to refuel in Russian bases the other side of Warsaw before returning home. The Russians refused permission for refueling. Roosevelt agreed to a suggestion by Churchill that they should jointly appeal to Stalin to rethink.
We believe that all 3 of us should do the utmost to save as many of the Patriots as possible. We hope that you will drop immediate supplies and munitions to the Patriot Poles in Warsaw. Or will you agree to help our planes in doing it very quickly?
Within 48 hours, Stalin turned down his allies' appeal in a crescendo of abuse at the Poles who were dying in their thousands to liberate Warsaw from the Nazis.
Sooner or later, the truth about the handful of power-seeking criminals who launched the Warsaw Adventure will out.
The next day, Roosevelt was sent by Churchill an eyewitness report of the horrors in Warsaw. The dead, it said, are buried in backyards and squares. Roosevelt replied,
I do not see that we can take any additional steps at the present time that promise results. Roosevelt.
Churchill persisted. He asked Roosevelt to join him in sending a second request to Stalin for refueling facilities. Roosevelt responded with a second put-down.
I do not consider it advantageous to the long-range general war prospect for me to join with you in the proposed message to Uncle Joe.
While the people of Warsaw rotted, Roosevelt would do no more, privately or publicly, to upset Stalin. In these same days, Paris was being liberated from the Nazis. There, the French underground had also risen against their occupiers when they knew the Allies were drawing near. But in Paris, the British and Americans diverted troops to help their fight. On August the 30th, Stalin's forces entered Romania's capital, Bucharest, and headed for Bulgaria. While his troops halted outside Warsaw, Eastern Europe was falling into his hands. Averell Harriman believes Stalin's ruthless duplicity required a reappraisal of Roosevelt's tactics. He cabled the president's closest associate, Harry Hopkins, in the White House.
There is every indication that the Soviet Union will become a world bully wherever their interests are involved, unless we take issue with the present policy.
But Roosevelt had no intention of changing tack. At this time, he was meeting Churchill at a conference in Quebec. Both men had lost interest in the Warsaw Rising. It was not once discussed. And Roosevelt had other things on his mind. He was campaigning to be re-elected president for a fourth term. But he was carrying a secret. 6 months before, his doctors had diagnosed hypertension in his heart. Though his illness was kept under wraps, his physical decline was obvious. At Quebec, Roosevelt's companion, Daisy Suckley, compared the president and the prime minister.
The PM looks better to me, because he is not so florid and not so fat as he was. The Prez, on the other hand, worries me. He gets so awfully tired and has no chance to rest. This campaign will wear him still further.
Churchill's wife, Clementine, also noticed the change. She wrote to her daughter Mary from Roosevelt's country house where she and Churchill had gone on to stay.
The president, with all his genius, does not, indeed cannot, partly because of his health and partly because of his makeup, function round the clock like your father. I should not think that his mind was pinpointed on the wall for more than 4 hours a day, which is not really enough when one is a supreme warlord.
Despite his ill health, Roosevelt was determined to carry on as president, convinced that he, better than anyone else, could bring a lasting peace to the world.
I have already indicated to you why I accept the nomination.
The key to that remained his handling of Stalin, and he continued to see evidence that it was working. The Poles of Warsaw were still fighting on, and 7 weeks into the rising, Stalin at last agreed to airdrop limited aid. On September the 24th, he presented a very different face to Harriman.
For the first time, Stalin spoke with sympathy for the insurgents. He said that the Red Army was in contact with each of the groups, by radio and by men going back and forth. Stalin showed none of his previous vindictiveness.
Did Stalin mean it? Or was he being cynically opportunistic? The simple fact was that the Nazis had effectively destroyed the Polish underground, and with the deed done, magnanimity came free. On October the 2nd, the Warsaw Uprising was over. The underground commander, General Buhr, surrendered to the Nazis. Nearly 250,000 people died. One of the last broadcasts from Warsaw said,
"May God, who is just, pass judgment on the terrible injustice suffered by the Polish nation, and may he punish accordingly all those who are guilty."
The Warsaw tragedy had a vital impact on the three Allied warlords. For Roosevelt, Stalin's about turn at the end showed that his behavior could be moderated by friendly appeals. At this time, he compared the Soviet Union with a growing child, which had to toddle before it could learn to walk. Stalin could conclude that even when he behaved badly, Roosevelt would not confront him. And Churchill saw that if confrontation was out, the best way to preserve British influence in Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean was to do a deal with Stalin. In October 1944, he went to Moscow to do just that. Stalin was on his best behavior. Among his other murderous talents, he'd always had the ability to charm. Avril Harriman reported back to Roosevelt.
Stalin was in high mood yesterday. He paid Churchill an unusual and significant compliment by attending the ballet at the Opera House.
Now that Stalin's collaboration was his only hope, Churchill began to paint him in warmer colors, writing home to Clementine,
I have had very nice talks with the old bear. I like him the more I see him. Now they respect us here, and I'm sure they wish to work with us. I have to keep the President in constant touch, and this is the delicate side.
Roosevelt had suspected, rightly, that Churchill was up to his old imperialist tricks. At one of his tete-a-tetes with Stalin, Churchill secretly produced what he later called his naughty document, carving up Eastern Europe into British and Russian spheres of influence. In Romania and Bulgaria, the Russians would have 90% influence, in Greece the British 90%, Yugoslavia and Hungary 50-50. Churchill guiltily told Stalin,
It is better to express these things in diplomatic terms and not to use the phrase dividing into spheres, because the Americans might be shocked.
But though the naughty document remained secret, Roosevelt was informed of the broad thrust of the deal, and he was not shocked. What mattered to him was that Churchill was now trying to seek compromise with Stalin rather than confrontation. In November, Roosevelt was re-elected president for an unprecedented fourth term. He must have known he was unlikely to live for its full 4 years, and was a man in a hurry. He'd long had a vision of a post-war world in which the great powers, Russia and the United States, along with Britain and China, would act, in his words, as policemen, allowing the rest of the world's nations their freedom and independence, but ensuring they could not start wars. Stalin had warmed to Roosevelt's idea, which would place the Soviet Union at the top table of the world's nations. Now Roosevelt's great and final mission was to turn the dream into practical reality. It all depended on winning Stalin's collaboration, not in words, but in deeds. "1945 would see not just the endgame on the battlefield, but also the endgame in the private war of the warlords. For Hitler, the outlook was clear. He told his adjutant,
"I know the war is lost. I'd like most of all to put a bullet through my head. We'll not capitulate, never. We can go down, but we will take a world with us."
Hitler's world was dissolving. By January 1945, the British and Americans were lining up on Germany's western border. The Red Army was heading into East Germany. And the three Allied warlords were preparing to converge on Yalta in the Crimea for their second face-to-face meeting. Their agenda, the future of the world. Stalin had refused to travel outside the Soviet Union, subjecting Roosevelt to a long, exhausting journey. As Daisy Suckley noted in her diary, the last thing the president needed was to be away from home.
January 22nd, 1945. The P doesn't relish this trip at all, thinks it will be very wearing, and feels that he will have to be so much on the alert in his conversations with Uncle Joe and WSC. The conversations will last interminably and will involve very complicated questions.
On February the 3rd, Roosevelt landed at Saki Airport in the Crimea. Churchill had already arrived and was in the welcoming party, along with his doctor, Charles Morin.
February the 3rd, 1945. He sat looking straight ahead with his mouth open, as if he were not taking things in. Everyone was shocked by his appearance and gabbled afterwards.
From Saki Airport, it was a 7-hour drive to Yalta, what Churchill called the Riviera of Hades. The opening dinner gave little encouragement of Roosevelt's appetite for the task ahead. The British Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, was among the guests.
February the 4th, 1945. Dinner with Americans. A terrible party, I thought. The President vague and loose and ineffective. Winston, understanding that business was flagging, made desperate efforts and 2 long speeches to get things going again. Stalin's attitude to small countries struck me as grim, not to say sinister. I was greatly relieved when the whole business was over.
But appearances were deceptive. Roosevelt had 2 key objectives at Yalta. The first and most immediate was to secure Russian entry into the war against Japan after Germany's defeat. Roosevelt succeeded by secretly bribing Stalin with offers of Japanese and Chinese territory. The second, and most important, was to agree with Stalin the structure of a post-war United Nations organization, headed by a Security Council. This would be the practical outcome of Roosevelt's vision of the great powers acting as the world's policemen. In this, Roosevelt also won Stalin's agreement. But, whatever the words, the real question was Stalin's actions. Would he now become a protector or an oppressor? The crucible remained Poland, which was now occupied by Russian troops. Roosevelt and Churchill confirmed that a large swathe of Polish territory would be handed to the Soviet Union. In return, Stalin promised free elections in Poland. He told Churchill,
"The Soviet Union is interested in the creation of a mighty, free, and independent Poland. It's a question of honor, because the Russians have committed many sins against the Poles in the past, and the Soviet government wishes to make amends."
But Roosevelt privately offered Stalin plenty of license.
The United States will never lend its support in any way to any provisional government in Poland that would be inimical to your interests.
At the time, Yalta seemed to herald a new era of cooperation. Alexander Cadogan, permanent Under-Secretary at the British Foreign Office, and a seasoned and skeptical diplomat, noted,
"I have never known the Russians so easy and accommodating. In particular, Joe has been extremely good. He is a great man, and shows up very impressively against the background of the other two aging statesmen. I think the conference has been quite successful. We've got an agreement on Poland which may heal differences for some time at least, and assure some degree of independence to the Poles."
Roosevelt was sure Yalta had been a success. He told his doctor, Admiral McIntyre,
"I've got everything I came for, and not at too high a price. The one nettlesome problem is Poland. The settlement we have in mind leaves much to be desired."
After Yalta, Roosevelt traveled back to America via Egypt. At Alexandria, Churchill gave what would turn out to be his final salute to the president. And he too now thought Stalin would keep his word. He reflected to his colleagues,
Poor Neville Chamberlain believed he could trust Hitler. He was wrong. But I don't think I'm wrong about Stalin.
Roosevelt, on his arrival home in Washington, told his cabinet,
"Stalin has something else in his being besides this revolutionist Bolshevist thing. Perhaps it is to do with his early training for the priesthood. I think that something entered into his nature of the way in which a Christian gentleman should behave."
Back in Moscow, Stalin was also pleased. It seemed to him his allies had, by nods and winks, accepted his sovereignty over Eastern Europe. When his foreign minister, Molotov, expressed a worry that some of the wording in the Yalta agreements could get in Russia's way, Stalin told him,
"Never mind. We'll do it in our own way later."
Yalta heralded a new age of freedom and peace. The same day, Stalin's deputy foreign minister, Vyshinsky, was in Bucharest installing a puppet government for Romania. There was no consultation with the British and Americans, as required in the words of the Yalta agreements. But Stalin had not interfered in Greece, where Churchill was using British forces to repress an attempted communist takeover. It was tit for tat. The test remained Poland. There, the reality of Stalin's promises was emerging. The NKVD was rounding up potential opponents in their thousands. There was no sign of the promised free elections. As reports of Soviet oppression filtered out, Churchill was coming under severe criticism in Parliament and within his government for betraying Poland at Yalta. He asked Roosevelt to join him in a protest to Stalin. Roosevelt knew full well how much leeway Stalin had been given at Yalta, and told Churchill they must wait.
I feel that our personal intervention would best be withheld until every other possibility of bringing the Soviet government into line has been exhausted.
Churchill, under mounting political embarrassment, continued to fire cables at Roosevelt.
At Yalta, we agreed to take the Russian view of the frontier line. Poland has lost her frontier. Is she now to lose her freedom?
Roosevelt was getting the same message from Averell Harriman, his ambassador in Moscow.
March 21st. We must come clearly to realize that the Soviet program is the establishment of totalitarianism, ending personal liberty and democracy as we know it.
On March the 27th, 16 leaders of the Polish underground were invited by Russian commanders in Poland to discuss local arrangements. It was a trick. They were kidnapped by the NKVD. They would later be subject to a show trial in Moscow and sent to the Gulag. Finally, at the end of March, Roosevelt agreed to admonish Stalin about the imposition of his puppet government in Poland.
I must make it quite plain to you that any solution which would result in a thinly disguised continuance of the present Warsaw regime would be unacceptable.
But Roosevelt still believed that he could persuade Stalin to fall in line.
Having understood each other so well at Yalta, I am convinced that the three of us can and will clear away any obstacles which have developed since then.
Some doubts were pricking Roosevelt's natural optimism. He told one of his staff,
"We've taken a great risk here, an enormous risk. I'm worried. I still think Stalin will be out of his mind if he doesn't cooperate. But maybe he's not going to, in which case we're going to have to take a different view."
Despite his worries, neither Roosevelt nor his military chiefs in Europe would do anything to thwart Stalin's land grab. On March the 30th, the Allied Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, sent a signal to Stalin, without consulting his British allies, saying that he was concentrating his forces on southern Germany, rather than Berlin. Stalin could hardly believe his luck. The next day, April the 1st, he signaled back to Eisenhower.
Your plans completely coincide with the plans of the Red Army. Berlin has lost its former strategic importance.
Stalin instantly summoned his two marshals, Zhukov and Konyev, and demanded of them,
"Who is going to take Berlin? Are we or the Allies?"
Zhukov and Konyev began a race to Berlin. Roosevelt had gone to Warm Springs, his retreat in Georgia, to rest. His peace was now interrupted by the only unpleasant row in his entire relationship with Stalin. The German commander in the south, General Kesselring, had put out feelers to the British and Americans to negotiate a surrender. Stalin smelled conspiracy. He made the lethal and false accusation that the British and Americans were doing a secret deal to free the Nazis to fight against Russia. Roosevelt was so annoyed that for the very first time he allowed his staff to send in his name angry words to the Soviet leader.
Frankly, I cannot avoid a feeling of bitter resentment toward your informers, whoever they are, for such vile misrepresentations of my actions or those of my trusted subordinates. Roosevelt.
Stalin quickly saw his mistake in angering the man who had given him so much. He wrote to Roosevelt,
"I have never doubted your integrity or trustworthiness, just as I have never questioned the integrity or trustworthiness of Mr. Churchill."
Once again, Roosevelt could believe that Stalin would always respond to his appeals. On April the 11th, in a message he wrote himself, he told Churchill,
"I will them straighten out. We must be firm, however, and our course thus far is correct."
It was the authentic voice of Roosevelt, keeping his options open, but above all, seeking to avoid confrontation with Stalin. The next day, April the 12th, 1945, would shatter the world. April the 12th, 1945. Warm Springs, Georgia. Daisy Suckley's diary.
Another beautiful day, with the promised heat. F woke up with a slight headache and a stiff neck, which probably comes from being overtired. The pouch from Washington won't arrive until after 11. At the moment, everything is peaceful.
As the sun hovered over Warm Springs, it was setting over Berlin. That evening, as the fighting grew ever nearer and Hitler faced his final days in the bunker, the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra gave its last wartime performance. Beethoven's Violin Concerto, Bruckner's Eighth Symphony, and the finale to Wagner's Gotterdammerung. In Moscow, Stalin was meeting a delegation of Yugoslav communists. He described to one of them, Miloran Djilas, his view of the new superpower world.
This war is not as in the past. Whoever occupies a territory also imposes on it his own social system. Everyone imposes his own system as far as his army has the power to do so. It cannot be otherwise.
In London, Churchill was given news of a family tragedy. His wife's cousin, Tom Mitford, and a close family friend, Basil Dufferin, had both been killed in action. At Warm Springs, Roosevelt was having his portrait painted. The artist said he looked so much better. She was pleased she had not started work the day before.
I was crocheting on the sofa. About 1 p.m. I glanced up from my work. F seemed to be looking for something, his head forward, his hands fumbling. I went forward and looked into his face. "Have you dropped your cigarette?" He looked at me, with his forehead furrowed in pain, and tried to smile. He put his hand up to the back of his head and said, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head." About 3:15, F's breathing became very heavy and labored. I had a distinct feeling that this was the beginning of the end. 25 minutes of 4. It was the end. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the hope of the world, is dead.
Roosevelt's death left his duel with Stalin unfinished. In the final days of his life, he realized that his great gamble with the Soviet leader might be failing. But he had by no means given up on it, and was not yet ready to confront him. Daisy Suckley summed it up in her diary a few days later.
Franklin himself did not have too much faith in Stalin, but he thought that he and Stalin looked at things in the same practical way, and for that reason there was much hope that Stalin would follow along.
On April the 25th, Russian and American soldiers linked up on the River Elbe. The scenes of mutual celebration seemed to herald a new world of cooperation for which Roosevelt had been willing to give so much. But these images were deceptive. In the coming months and years, Stalin would isolate the nations he'd occupied in Eastern Europe from the capitalist West and build a totalitarian empire. Some believe that, had Roosevelt lived, he might have moderated Stalin's actions. But while Stalin made gestures and promises for Roosevelt, he always did what he wanted. Roosevelt's flaw was in believing Stalin was at heart a politician like himself, albeit a harsh one. What he never understood, or chose not to understand, was the reality of Stalin. The combination, equaled only by Hitler, of cruelty, paranoia, ideology, and greed for power. In July 1945, the victors gathered at Potsdam, just outside Berlin. Roosevelt was dead. Hitler had shot himself. Churchill was about to be voted out of office by the British people. One man stood triumphant: Stalin, the new Emperor of Russia and half of Europe. How different it was from those scenes of Hitler's triumph in Berlin in the same month of July, 5 years before. They closed one chapter in world history, the age of European empires. Stalin's triumph opened another, the age of two ideologically opposed superpowers, and the Cold War which would last nearly half a century. On one level, the outcome had been decided by the march of events and mass armies. But the orchestrators were the four warlords. Their war of the mind had shaped a new world.
That was the last in the series. More facts and insights into the lives of the four warlords are at channel4.com/history. Now, do you remember Anthony Hutton? The Big Brother champion is free to lap up the fame. The winner's story, next on 4.